they didn't really go into it too much, but I guess the main thing that has been on my mind lately has been the order of the transcendentals, and DC Schindler has a convergence with this other Eastern Orthodox author, theologian, I guess, that I was reading. I don't know if you know of the book, but it's like somewhat seems like it's somewhat popular in this sort of corner of the internet. Um,
Okay. Who is
but
that by?
the Timothy Pappas,
Okay.
but he has the same exact um, sort of thesis as DC Schindler and puts it very strongly that the proper ordering of the transcendentals is beauty into goodness into truth, and that starting in particular that starting with truth, which he argues is sort of the modern tendency or default, leads to well various issues such as relativism. And so I just thought that was interesting that they were both coming at that independently, seemingly from both the Eastern and Western um, uh, Christian philosophical tradition. And then there's all, I mean, I think DC Schindler's getting some thumbs or von Balthasar, who I know like J.P. Marceau has read, and I'm also interested in reading. So yeah, I was just curious of your thoughts on that as like the sequence, the proper sequence of the transcendental, because Schindler says the primacy of beauty, the centrality of goodness, and then the ultimacy of truth. So they each have as Rebecca said, a superlative, but in a different way, in a different order. Even though Schindler also acknowledged that he can see arguments for other orderings. That's kind of what I've been sort of trying to say, get a perspectival sense of or embody or try to look for patterns, although I'm not. Yeah, it seems plausible, but I'm just curious of your thoughts on it.
Well, most of my like I don't know, wrestling with the transcendentals has been like just recently over the last few months, and really since that conversation with between Vervaeke and Pajot and Jordan Peterson that we had our conversation around. Um, and and so I'm noticing like Vervaeke Vervaeke talks about in that conversation he talked about beauty and goodness, and he didn't get to truth. And I'm noticing like for me, truth is probably the kind of the one that I least understand and almost like least care about.
Mm,
And um whereas beauty and goodness, I've been like kind of developing those more in my own experience and just like trying to like articulate them for myself, uh just so that I don't know that I can internalize them better. um so I'll see if I can kind of, yeah, put this together kind of how I've been thinking about it. um which is it, a lot of it really comes back to this conformity theory of knowing, like the contact epistemology.
hmm
Like that's central for me, and this is and the way that the way that I've been thinking about it is, um we're 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 in some sort of uh conformity with reality, and ultimately like trying to come into conformity with deeper and deeper layers of reality. And like the end of that would be, conformity with the ground of being or God, and that theosis. um and when Vervaeke says that beauty is, and I actually don't know, again, this is just I'm pulling a lot from Vervaeke because I'm not as familiar with like DC Schindler and everything that Schindler is pulling from.
hmm
And so I don't remember exactly where Vervaeke is pulling all this from, but he says beauty is when appearances disclose reality.
Yeah,
So
that's
that,
what Schindler says.
yeah, that to me is like, it's like when that you see some pattern, you're locked onto some pattern, like you're conformed to some pattern, but there's something there's something behind that that's more real, and beauty is when that opens up, when the appearances open up to disclose that deeper reality. And that deeper reality is something you're called to. It's like, I want to be conformed to that.
Mhm.
That's the experience of beauty. Um, and then goodness, again, the way that Vervaeke talked about it is the weddedness to reality, that makes possible intelligibility. And that the way he put it was like the promise that
Yeah.
intelligibility is inexhaustible. Like you are always forever wedded to reality, or something along those lines.
Mhm.
Um, and then truth, it's like, I don't know, I haven't really thought about truth in this framework, because it seems like it's almost yeah, I'd be curious to hear, like, if you want to say anything about what I've said about beauty and goodness, but then also add on truth, because to me that it's like, for some reason I just don't care about it. It's like it just falls like, truth is um truth is just there. Like there's beauty and goodness, and then truth is just there afterwards. I
That's
don't
actually almost explicitly what Timothy Patasa describes it as.
really. Okay,
And I
interesting.
almost thought it was like kind of trivializing truth. He's like, well, once you've got beauty and goodness, then you've already got truth. You don't have to like go another step. And I'm like, what? Is it not even its own transcendental?
Well, if
I,
that's
I
what it
understand
feels
what
like,
you're saying in some way.
yeah, like, why do you why put it as a distinct category if it's sort of derivative?
Yeah. So DC Schindler says beauty is the appearance of reality, which I think is basically what John is saying, disclosing
Yeah.
reality. And I think also that appearance can very much be described as a symbol, or symbolon is what Schindler says sometimes. And I remember
Mm.
he said one thing near the end in their talk, that he thought the notion of symbolon is increasingly going to be like a really significant um, term for, he said, like the gathering energy of like minds around this sort of era. And I think you can see, Pajot for sure tapping into that, because it sort of connects the disembodiment of especially um, affected by technology. So, and then goodness was, Schindler defines it as the free self-offering to the other, um, in a kind of reciprocal way, perhaps. And then truth as the reception of reality on its own terms, which sounds very similar to beauty. It's almost like you go back to the beginning or something. But I agree with you in terms of truth in some sense, because if you start with truth, then it almost leads to like combinatorial explosion immediately, because everything is true in some sense for it to exist. It's just what, as Pajot would say, like, in what manner is it true? And so if you get concerned with truth, then it's probably because you have a certain mode of truth that you're particularly obsessed with reducing things to, and therefore you're going to, not have the most wise relationship, say, to the other transcendentals. Like they'll sort of appear contingently or in a reduced form. Um, and then, but like you said, if you follow beauty and then into goodness, or you could almost say, was it, I think Pope Benedict XVI talked about, like, if you, the movement of eros into agape, and that if eros never unfolds into agape, then you also lose eros. And then you can kind of, I don't know if this has to do with truth, but regarding beauty and goodness, I think you can kind of connect beauty to eros and goodness to agape in some sense. And so I think that movement does make sense. Like, you're first drawn towards something, like you were saying, the beauty of it, and then you want to sort of give to it to like increase its presence in the world and conform to it and maybe identify with it in some sense. Um, and so that would be like goodness as the free self-offering is DC Schindler. I think that's his definition. It's very close to that, whatever it is. Uh, yeah, and then like you said, because truth is sort of everywhere in some sense. If you start with beauty and then go into goodness, then you've already got sort of the right kind of relevant truth for for you as an embodied agent, um, assuming it's real beauty and real goodness. Yeah.
I'm also like thinking about if you start with truth, it's almost like you're starting with the proposition, kind of.
Mm,
Not that truth is necessarily,
really
reduced to
proposition.
propositions, but where I don't know, starting with beauty, there's something more about just participation. Like it stacks up from participation. Um,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
the
I'm
point,
wondering. Oh,
yeah.
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say the point about eros into agape, sort of mapping onto beauty into goodness. That made me think of the uh, I think it was in the one of the talks, DC Schindler talks that you sent me, where he talks about love as saying to the other, "It is good that you exist,"
Yeah.
which is sort of, I mean, that is agapic. It's that it's. I think about like the way Vervaeke talks about agape as the parent's love for the child that brings the child into being. The parent is saying to the child, it is good that you exist. And so that goodness, I don't know, something about the goodness. That's what came up for me.
It's almost like both, isn't it? Saying it is good that you exist is like eros and agape in some sense, because you're not willing it's good separately, but you're seeing that it is good in a kind of acknowledgement of its beauty. It seems to me almost. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the way that I've sort of been interpreting that is more like kind of it is good that you exist, and it's the kind of shining on its own rather than like it's good that you exist and I want to consume you. Like
Yeah.
it's more of the thing you would say about, your child rather than like a piece of food. But that may just be I may be reducing that.
Well,
And
I think you're also getting to the point that it's non-instrumental. So it's like getting just to the essence of a thing, which DC Schindler also talks about in, well, yeah, in Love and the
right.
Postmodern Predicament. I really like that early section where he's saying this is like the least philosophical age because people are less concerned with what things are in themselves as opposed to how they affect things. And so it's like reason becomes reduced to instrumentality. And then they talked last night about how if you define reason as causal or like affecting things or instrumental basically in a reduced sense of reason, and then you define humans as being, basically rational as their core trait in that reduced sense of rationality, then the world becomes a problem to be solved because that's what reason does, is like solve problems instrumentally. So then
Yeah,
there's no sense of the beauty of the world. Go ahead.
there was something in I think at that same DC Schindler talk uh where he talks about intellection as sort of a fundamentally I don't know, divine activity on its own, like um just apprehending something, like just to see, like you would with another person, where you're not trying to, there's no instrumentality involved, you're just perceiving this person, and like what we had talked about, your notion of essence locking,
Mm,
that is in and of itself, um I don't know, there's something like, there's something even more profound about that activity of just beholding something without, trying to do anything with it.
Appreciatively.
That's sort of what, yeah, that was at least the way I interpret it. That's what he was conveying, is um, just that mere intellection of something.
As like divine intrinsically.
I don't know if that's exactly the way he phrased it, but that was the gist of it. Is like uh sort of a core human activity, even more, potentially even more um divine or valuable, or however you want to
Oh
put
yeah,
it.
I think it might be the part you're talking about. I remember him saying that like recognizing things accurately, naming them, what was it? Naming them accurately or authentically or adequately, is in some ways more, at least more like pure of a good in Christian terms than
Yeah.
like almsgiving, helping others. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah,
in some
that's what I
ways.
was getting at. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so I agree with all that. That's great. Um, but before I forget it, there is an issue with the beauty first approach, so to speak, that I kind of first, I mean, I think it was first Pajot that, and then maybe some comments in his videos that sort of exposed me to consider it seriously. Because before I definitely was truth first sort of mode for the rest of my life prior to the last couple of years or so. And one issue is that it seems as though the beauty first approach may conflict with Vervaeke's model of plausibility, which I really appreciated before that, where you have the equal balance, I don't know if you'd say, between trustworthiness and elegance, right? And obviously elegance is connected to beauty, sure, but like what if, like where's the self-correction for high elegance but low trustworthiness um, theories or ideas, which I think he put into the conspiracy theory bubble, or like the different imbalances between the two inputs and outputs. And yeah, I guess I'm somewhat concerned about that form of self-deception if you go with a beauty first approach, that plausibility gets thrown out the window in some sense, or at least half of it, and therefore the structure of plausibility as a metric for uh well, yeah, I guess for truth seeking, which already implies a truth first approach. But you see what I'm saying?
Is it Is it because you associate beauty with one or the other of elegance, and like you associate beauty with elegance and not trustworthiness, or
Well,
what
yeah,
is
I hadn't really thought about how it associates with each, but intuitively it does seem connected to elegance for sure. But I'm not so sure about trustworthiness necessarily. And like just on a more basic level, even like if you go with the beauty first approach, um, like how do you evaluate the plausibility of something? For example, very uh sort of idealized religious claims that seem too good to be true, for example.
I see. Okay, so what you're saying is if you start with truth, you can you can evaluate plausibility by weighing things like elegance versus trustworthiness. Whereas
Right. It seems like it.
if you start with beauty into goodness and then to truth, then you're sort of forced into evaluating truth just on the basis of its beauty and goodness.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose so. And I agree with what we're saying, that everything is true in some sense, but I wonder whether the beauty first approach may lead you toward focusing on things that are beautiful, but in a kind of rose-colored glasses sense, if that makes sense. I don't know. It's just a concern. I still think it's largely the best framework, but for example, I mean, Like that was one argument Pajot gave for, the various, like moving more so past the divide of like religious miraculous claims, where instead of going with some leap of faith, you just take a beauty first approach, for example, to like the resurrection. And then he tried to, it seemed to me he was using Anselm's ontological argument, but for narrative instead of the existence of God. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Like if something is perfect in all these ways, then it must exist because existence is also a quality. And like Kant and others have criticized that, but it seemed as though Pajot was doing that for the main Christian claims, but in terms of a narrative, like if it's the best story, yeah, if it's the best story, which he'll often say, then it has to be true in some sense. And I'm still not necessarily convinced by that seemingly narrative version of the ontological argument, but it seems connected to this beauty first approach, and it's always kind of there's been something about it that doesn't totally sit well with me, even though I think there's a lot to be gained from the beauty first approach.
Well, okay, so on that, the point that Pajot, I guess, what you're saying, the point that Pajot tries to make about because it's the best story or most beautiful story, let's say, then therefore, it must be true.
Exactly.
What does he mean when he says that it must be true? Like, what does that actually mean? What is he adding to the statement of the story is beautiful and good? What is he adding to it by saying, therefore, it is also true?
I think he would say that because given those premises, then it must be true at all levels of reality, as he would say, like the Jordan Peterson. Like it can't just be true at the symbolic level, or it's not, because beauty is kind of holistic, maybe he would say. And it's like if it's that overall defining, it has to have like a historical element, etc. I'm guessing that's what he would say. He said similar things. But my concern is even if that is the case for the Christian narrative, like what if I can just see that leading to bullshit in other cases if someone really wants something to be true because it's so beautiful. Like myself, like I for many, I mean, I still kind of want to for so many years wanted, there to be the capacity to find dimensions to portals to other dimensions of like, especially the world of Pokemon. I would like search for it when I was young. Like it's just it has to be true because I'm focusing on it so much. Like the sort of the secret sort of what do you call it, manifesting, that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, then I mean, part of that issue is like sort of idiosyncratic notions of beauty versus, is versus like sort of more intersubjective. Like, what do we agree is beautiful, or what is just my own, personal, uh, because people can have kind of, I guess, like warped aesthetics. I think about Peterson
No,
every
for sure.
time I think about that because he talks about not that he has a warped aesthetic, but he
Oh,
talks
okay. I
about
was
like
wondering.
he talks about evil as I guess in reference to like Nazi Germany, sort of the some of the particular atrocities there, like the Nazis having a what he described as a demonically warped aesthetic, which always comes up for me when I think about uh, beauty as sort of being sort of primary, I guess, which is when it comes to perceiving the good and the true. It's like, well, how do I know that my own sort of aesthetic sense isn't like twisted in some way
Yeah, for sure.
that's sort of deluding me and deceiving me.
So I agree that that would correct for a lot of it, but I'm wondering, is that a sufficient correction to that potential for bullshit or self-deception? Like basically, if it is, then that does imply that whatever is objectively beautiful, or transjectively of the whole beautiful is, actual in the way that it seems to be, which is an interesting claim. So yeah, I guess my question is that a sufficient correction? Getting rid of idiosyncratic notions of beauty. And obviously that is, kind of the prime issue if you have that epistemology, essentially, is making sure you have good taste. And David Bentley Hart talks about that. In his Beauty of the Infinite book, it basically says, the first issue is having good taste. And, Nietzsche had very good arguments, but he just had bad taste in the end. It's an interesting claim.
Huh.
He's very, very much on rhetoric over dialectic. So I'd be curious to see you and John.
I would want to go, I
That.
would want to like delve into that notion of good taste versus bad taste. Like, what is that? How can you have bad taste, first of all? What does that mean? Because it sort of gives beauty this more, I don't know, objective. I hate using the words objective and subjective, but it kind of suggests that beauty has there's this comes up a lot actually in conversations with like, close friends of mine, like in the theater world and art world and stuff like that, where it's people will say things like, well, beauty is just subjective. And I want to immediately fight that, but I don't want to fight it with no, beauty is objective. But what I am trying to get at is like this sense of there is bad art and good art. And but what does that actually mean? Because it's there like beauty is yeah, I'm not finding the words for what I'm trying, but it's that how do you navigate this notion of good aesthetics versus bad aesthetics
I
while
mean, you just
still like that there's this transjective notion makes beauty in part a personal thing.
yeah. I mean, I think you just touched on it a little bit with the Nazi aesthetic. Like that was bad taste in a sort of metaphysical bad sense, as Peterson was saying. And obviously everyone recognizes, like you said, that there's good art and bad art. And I mean, for a while, I think I had a kind of Kantian explanation where beauty for good art is, yeah, you could say it's objective, but we don't have direct access to that ever. We only ever have access to it through our subjectivity. And therefore, I mean, I would say this exists at all levels. Like I said, I think in the text, I kind of see objectivity and subjectivity as asymptotic poles that you can never get to purely. And so whenever you experience art or beauty, it's transjective. And because we share the same nature largely, even with our own, unique sort of environmental factors and unique genetic factors, et cetera, there'll be some difference, but as humans, largely we'll be able to agree on, you could say, the transcendent objective. You could say pure objectivity and transcendence of reality maybe are sort of isomorphic, but we only, experience them relationally. So there's going to be some agreement on through the sort of shared transjective experience of things of beauty. So you can have, aesthetic criticism and so on. And so therefore, in a sense, if you take the beauty first model, then developing, good taste, so to speak, is kind of how you refine your, well, John Milbank hates epistemology in general, but your epistemology, if you want to use that term, which is rather interesting. But it kind of implies that, right? If you take that approach. I don't know, does that make sense? Like, that's what I always argue with people who say it's purely subjective, because I think that's very common. So I think it's good to have a response for people when they say that.
Well, what's coming up for me is like going back to kind of how I was trying to describe the way I'm understanding beauty at the beginning of this as like that next deeper layer of reality opening up to you that you weren't previously conformed to, and now it's calling you into conformity with it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like as you go deeper, 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 you get a better and better aesthetic sense, something like that. Whereas if you're like way out here, like not very mature, not very wise, not really like you're just sort of living in a shallow way,
Hmm.
you are uh you're not going to have that refined taste because that you it's yeah, it's beauty. What beauty is opens up to you the more that you move into beauty and experience and conform yourself to those deeper layers, something like that. And then
Yeah.
the other thing that is coming up is like the just the notion of self-deception itself is that idea that we can be deceived by, we can be seduced into things that are, um, we think we experience them as beautiful, but it's some sort of, we're being deceived in some way. And it's, I want to say it's like not a real experience of beauty. Like if you really experience beauty, it would be, but like you don't have a good sense of that. Um, if you haven't, if you haven't, moved into deeper and deeper layers, and the deeper and deeper you go, the more you have the more wise you are, I guess. It's kind of
Yeah.
how I
Well,
think.
yeah. I feel like usually the deception part is about to end, so I'll email you a new link. Um, like the deception moments are usually because of inflating one aspect that is beautiful on its own at the expense of the whole, which is not actually beautiful, but they're just zeroing in, like they have too narrow
Yes.
of a focus that they don't. Yeah, they miss the forest for the trees in some
Yes.
sense. Yeah. So it's like there is beauty, but it's the whole is not beautiful. So they're just there's a term I keep forgetting. Might have been John, but yeah, like the well, actually Whitehead defines evil as kind of the uh, using the lesser good at the expense of a greater good at the expense. Yeah, so it's like
That's what I was gonna say.
self-destructive.
It seems this also maps onto goodness in some way,
Yeah,
sense of like an addiction being getting locked into a lesser good
yeah,
and not recognizing that it's pointing to a higher good.
yeah. So the the plausibility issue, do you think that becomes solved if you have good taste in the sense that you're recognizing, quote unquote, objective beauty as opposed to idiosyncratic inflation? Because I still wonder, like, surely, maybe not, but it seems as though if beauty, especially if you don't have a kind of like process model of time, if beauty does disclose truth, then objective beauty would be, um, much more, what am I trying to say? It seems as though if objective beauty is the truth, then it kind of implies a much more utopian world. And thus, the only reason that's not the case is that people have bad taste, almost. It seems like a kind of reductive argument, but I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, I think that's almost just like saying there is an ultimate reality to be conformed to, and it's possible to like not be conformed to that,
Hmm.
which I don't know. It's like what's the alternative to that? There's no ultimate reality to be conformed to, uh then what? What are we doing? Or maybe I kind of misunderstood what you're
No, I think that that's
saying
part of
there.
it. I guess it almost seems, it reminds me of Leibniz's best possible worlds sort of philosophy, that like technically, with his theology, we have to be living in the best possible world. It seems similar in the sense that if beauty discloses truth, then, or I guess it's more so Pajot's argument that if the most beautiful thing has to be true, then I guess you could say that the oh, the issue is with a kind of illusion or self-deception, or missing the mark. Um, that's the only reason why it's not sort of widespread. Um, I don't know if I'd put it any differently than the first way I put it. Yeah, like if what is most beautiful has to be true, then that would be a much more well, much less ugly world, I suppose. So then I guess you can argue that free will is more beautiful than not having free will, and that's sort of the justification for ugliness, at least contingently.
Oh, interesting. Or the justification for the capacity for self-deception or something like that.
Hmm.
Both of those. Because the freedom of choice is beautiful. Hmm.
Oh, that reminds me.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll write it down. Go ahead.
I kind of I want to get a clearer picture of, like, I get the sense there's some, like, this question you're struggling with about plausibility and uh truth,
Hmm.
and truth being derivative in some sense from beauty. And I want to try to draw that out more. I guess what is I want more of what you find problematic in that.
Well, I
I
guess
guess.
the trustworthiness half of the plausibility structure. So Vervaeke says high trustworthiness and high elegance means high plausibility. But what if you have a very beautiful theory, and elegant meaning applicable to various domains like holistic, but the trustworthiness, and this in some ways, especially if you don't have a strong, what would you say, a like a strong sense of tradition as like a living organic reality, then you could make that argument for yeah, for the Christian narrative, especially with like just the kind of small sources, like not a lot of largely collaborative sources, is why you get especially Protestant authors all debating on the reliability of the gospel witness and so on. So that would be in some sense low trustworthiness if you don't have a strong sense of like living tradition as trustworthy. But even then, you can make arguments that it the narrative was strong enough that it was able to develop over time without the initial claims being precise in the miraculous um, nature, right? So that, in some sense, the very example that Pajot is, using it to argue for, seems as though it might apply to the issue of the trustworthiness, elegance, imbalance, in a sense. Like it's highly elegant, sure, but the trustworthiness, even if you do think it's trustworthy, and at this point, I mean, I basically am committed to it. The trustworthiness does not seem to balance, which implies that plausibility as a primary metric for evaluating reality is not necessarily up to the task compared to like the beauty first model.
So now I'm wondering, trustworthiness in what sense?
Like, so Rick will say high degree of convergence of um, multiple pieces of evidence from different domains, different
Okay.
people. So
Like
in
the
this case,
five
it'd be like,
senses.
yeah, that's one, and then multiple people. So like in the case of the gospel narrative, multiple testimonies or like other sources or like analogous things occurring at other times and
Okay.
places, etc.
So convergence, um, with
Of
the
evidence
addition of, yeah, convergence of evidence and elegance of your, theory,
of
let's say.
explanatory power, yeah,
Yeah. Um, okay.
and, and beauty in a way. I think elegance and beauty are definitely connected.
Right. Right. Okay. So it's clear to you the beauty of, or let's say the elegance of Christianity, and what's less
In
clear.
in some of its better forms, for sure. Yeah,
Yes. Yes. I think that's true for me as well. But then it's trustworthiness in terms of the converging lines of evidence. Uh, but evidence for what? That's the question. Let's take the Christianity example in particular. Evidence for, like, it's like, okay, the resurrection.
yeah. I think that'd be the paradigmatic example for people. I mean, I think that's the big stumbling block for most people, at least in our kind of people who are philosophically inclined to accept a lot of the other Neoplatonic elements. Yeah.
So it's evidence that the resurrection historically happened.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most obvious example of this imbalance on the plausibility input output sort of thing.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, this is great because this is like the core issue where I get tripped up, which
Yeah.
is on the resurrection. And it's something that, like, multiple people have tried to ask both Pajot and Peterson, like, yeah, but let's get down to the historicity of the thing. Like, you keep skirting around, Peterson in particular just
Yeah.
will skirt around it. And to me, it's like, yeah, but any Christian you ask, it's going to be very clear for, like, like it really matters that the historical nature of the resurrection is core to what it means to, call yourself a Christian, is to assert that that actually happened. Um, I think I don't know, that's been my impression. Any Christian you ask is going to say that that's, fundamental.
Hmm.
Uh, and that's kind of where, for me, it's like, uh, I don't know that I can call myself a Christian, particularly because of that issue. Um, and and also I noticed, like, sorry if I'm kind of going afield from, like, the
Oh
core
no.
question here, but um I'm I've heard, like, the apologetics arguments for, like, the plausibility of the resurrection. There's all these converging lines of evidence, basically. And that to me always feels like, um I don't know, there's self-deception involved in that. It's like,
Mm.
you really think that this story hasn't over time sort of been, you know, drawn out and mythologized, and, who knows what. But, like, I don't know, to me that seems much more plausible than
Yeah.
a man actually coming back to life after being dead for 3 days. Um, and but yeah, and so I struggle with this because something Pajot has also said is like almost don't pay too much attention to that question or something, and more just, like, put on the lens of the resurrection, and then just, like, see things through that lens and see what happens. But I don't really know what that means exactly if you don't actually believe that the resurrection happened. If it's just, like, seeing symbolically through that, in that way, or what. Like, that's there's a lot of confusion here, just in this, like, I don't know, cultural space that we're in, where it's like, the people like Pajot and Peterson are skirting around this issue, whereas like a Protestant in particular would be like, no, this is this is an issue. You have to I don't know what to do with that. And
Yeah, I think, well, it might work better for different people. Well, I very much sympathize with you, first of all, because that's been my stance for a good decade or so. And I think Pajot's explanation, I think is sort of helpful, at least for me, because it sort of short circuits the usual historical, um, propositional, like, well, truth-based analysis. And then
right.
he said, like, if the model of like kenosis and resurrection is fractal and you can see it at other levels of reality, I think that's what he means by trying to use that lens. And then he'll say, okay, well, if it's so comprehensive, then it has to have a historical manifestation at some point, and then and then it's kind of like his ontological argument for the narrative. I don't know which one's more fishy, but
Yeah, see, I get that. I get that. Like I'm fully on board with like when you look at the whole picture, it has to have the historical element to it. But then if for me, if I just look at the historical picture, I'm like, no, it couldn't have happened.
yeah.
So I don't know how to put those two together.
And then he'll say, oh yeah, that if you see the pattern fractally, then you see that as like for the limit case, like simultaneously the highest version of it, and then also kind of the origin of everything else. And for me, okay, so I think I mentioned it at the retreat, but because I'd sort of been so immersed in a kind of evolutionary worldview, it was very important to me that I was able to reconcile that. And that's also why I was very alienated from my sort of more fundamentalist Protestant upbringing. And so someone like, even though I haven't even read him directly, but knowing that there's people like Teilhard de Chardin out there that have a kind of still a sense of that progressive evolution of complexity and complexification. And then also Greg Enriquez actually was very helpful with understanding the emergence vectors. So chemistry from matter, life from chemistry, and then into mind, like encephalization. And then I would say culture as like self-reflective, um, self-reflection through language, um, and tool making. And so if so for me, what was partially helpful was viewing the other emergence vectors, hypothetically from before they happened, from the previous one. It seems like absurd. And then understanding, connecting, what do you say, sort of getting rid of, not getting rid, but downplaying the, the literalist fall narrative as a historical event that caused, natural evil or death, and understanding death coming into the world or the fall as sort of or not, maybe even isomorphic with entropy, so that life or the evolution of complexification is kind of a not that entropy was necessary, but given entropy as sort of evil or the death, then it works off of that through natural selection. But then there's a kind of limit point of emergence and emanation where you can see, instead of cultural immortality, you get like a holistic resurrected immortality in a new emergence vector. It's been a while since I explicitly formulated it, but that helped me somewhat because, like, in addition to Pajot's sort of historical element plus everything else, but even still, like the plausibility thing, I kind of had to to give up on that model in some ways, and I still feel like there's something lost. So I guess I'm sort of wanting to figure out if it can be recovered, or like what is the issue with it. Because this isn't exactly an issue with the probability model per se, but I remember and the guy from Arthur Holmes from Wheaton College has this really great philosophy series, like 80 episode series on the history of philosophy. Highly recommended. Like a great old man professor, but he talks about Locke's idea of matching your degree of belief to the plausibility of the evidence, or the amount of evidence. And that's what I'd always done intuitively my whole life. So that allowed me to kind of always have a kind of gray area of like using percentages instead of saying black and white, like, yes, this is true, no, this is not true. And it felt very sophisticated, and I felt like I never had to be forced into a situation of making claims that outrun my reason. But then, he made the point, like, forget exactly why, but why would that necessarily be the case, or the best way to approach truth claims to match your degree of certainty to the degree of evidence, which is kind of trustworthiness. It doesn't get into elegance, but yeah, so that whole paradigm, I think if you take it seriously, it does kind of create problems for what we're talking about. Whereas the beauty first approach can sort of get around it. And yeah, I still feel like at times that there's something lost within the model, even though I think the beauty first approach has a lot of merit as well. So I very much sympathize with you, but there's various idiosyncratic ways I was able to like get over that. I don't know if that would work for everyone.
Yeah. One of the things that is slightly troubling for me is like, if you take this fractal view of the resurrection, like see that in everything at all these different levels, to me it seems like that would be instantiated in not just sort of the particular historical context of the Hebrew people, but like in every culture you're going to find that, like they have that, but like
Yeah,
there's a universality claim in Christianity of like, no, this Jesus is the Son of God. And that's part of what the issue, it's like, for the elegance to really work, I would need to see it in every single culture at all these different levels or something like that.
Yeah. No, I totally see
And
your
maybe
issue.
we do, I don't know.
Yeah. I think in some ways maybe that was more like a model, like the emergence vectors model was a way for me to imagine how it has a precedent, but then from there sort of retroactively take on more of the small o orthodox narrative of like, for example, Pajot saying to Verbeke, if relevance realization kind of goes all the way up to like the mind of God, you could say. And then if you have the pure, well, I was reading a lot of Whitehead at the time, so it was also very connected to that, where he has this idea of so for God, creativity is the kind of ground of being, and then God is basically the logos that orders the various possibilities into a determinate freedom, as opposed to their chaotic possibility. And so that was basically my Christology at the time, was that that Jesus fully embodied the Whiteheadian understanding of God as always in each actual occasion in his process metaphysics, following the superjective lure, as he calls it, of God as like the most intensity of experience. Maybe you could say beauty as well in each given moment that orders or harmonizes all the different past moments. Vervicki talked about this regarding, I think, Arugana as well. Like every past moment possible comes into each moment of experience, like the whole universe in some sense. And then there's like some kind of ideal action that could be taken. Anyway, that was in some sense what the incarnation was, and that there had to be a kind of idealized emergence for that, which would be Mary, essentially, as opposed to, I think we were talking about at the retreat, C.S. Lewis saying it was pure emanation. I definitely needed to have the sense of the simultaneity of the emergence. So I guess that would partially be, the evolution of humans, and then a particular culture that was more in alignment with, the principles of cosmic reality, like the logos. There, that would be where you put in the why it occurred with the Hebrew people, I suppose. But if basically I had to very, very significantly integrate it within an evolutionary framework and kind of humans as animals that evolve. Like once I would just like force those to be side by side and like smash them together, then it felt much less like self-deceptive in some way, or maybe it was just as much, but it felt much more plausible in some sense. Like that's why something like this is very helpful for me. By Connor Clement. He's a colleague of John Milbank, basically arguing for against ultra reductive Darwinism and creationism.
What was the subtitle on that?
Why the ultra Darwinists and creationists both get it wrong. So he's a colleague of John Milbank at the University of Nottingham. I haven't read too much of it, but I've listened to him before, and I really like him. But yeah, putting it in a more temporal and then cosmic framework of the various emergence vectors was very helpful for me. Whereas, someone like Pageau, they'll say, evolution, maybe it happened, but I don't believe in it. Whereas I still have a very evolutionary worldview. So that was very important for me. But I totally understand your objection with the different cultures. You'd think you'd see examples of it as well. So in that sense, I don't know. I guess you might be able to say.
At the same time, I do get what you're saying is that you would also expect to see like one culture in particular, sort of where this was manifest, I don't know, fully at like a larger scale or something. And which is sort of, I don't know, the Christian claim.
Yeah, and then if you see cultures as also cultural evolution as what do you call it, multi-level selection as like the next level of selection, as opposed to individuals, then you also can see Christianity as, kind of outcompeting by partially integrating the goods of other cultures over time. And therefore you don't necessarily have to, like, you can see the sort of one-time nature, at least so far historically, of that emergence vector of the resurrection as kickstarting a process of the culture or like the meta culture, the religion of Christianity as that which is carried forward toward that later being manifest in a more universal way, while dealing with other competing cultures in an evolutionary process, which largely it has been somewhat successful. Although then Pageau will talk about the self, death, and resurrection of Christianity, etc.
Right.
So because I was reading a lot about David Sloan Wilson is a biologist at the time who was basically coming around to the idea that religions, sort of like Brett Weinstein, but more, I think, sophisticated, were part of the evolutionary selection process. Because he was other individualist geneticists will sort of call him a group selectionist, which is kind of a dirty word in some circles, but we'll say multi-level selection.
Yeah. No, I think multi-level selection is like the most elegant way to frame evolution by natural selection. And I remember like I read Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, which made a huge impact on me coming out of like having been raised in like a creationist model. And then like reading that was like this huge, revolutionary process for me. Just to break it down in terms of like just seeing the mechanism that in the way he describes, he's very reductive at the, level of the gene, which I've since come to see is like, there's problems with that because of this, there's there's constraints on the gene from higher levels as well as from below. Like it's there, you have to consider all of the different levels. Like you have gene, you have the cell, you have the tissue and organ and organism, and the colony or tribe or nation state, all the way up and all the way down, and they're all interacting with each other. That's the issue, is you can't cleanly separate them out.
Then you even have other examples of like bee and ant colonies that are analogous to human large scale.
And then cultural art of like what you're saying, religion and various ideologies and beliefs and language. It's all interacting. And so
yeah. I guess also seeing people who I highly respected or admired their intelligence, like David Bentley Hart, making claims, like saying, he'll say was it in Paul? I mean, I'm no expert, like biblical scholar, but he'll say, because that was the earliest evidence, before the Gospels, was the epistles of Paul claiming to have seen with like crowds the resurrected Christ. And then like knowing someone like David Bentley Hart helped me to kind of have more plausibility for the position. And then like DC Schindler as well, in addition to just taking seriously Pajot's criticisms of kind of the ecology of practices model without a participatory central narrative and community, probably leaned me toward taking those more seriously. Yeah, I mean, I still feel sometimes like I was kind of what do you say, I guess my whole issue or concerns with the beauty first and goodness first model at the expense of truth, but what I've been talking about in some ways. But yeah.
Well, I think that's the issue of the ecology of practices versus sort of the narrative. Like you can't have the narrative without the ecology of practices. That's the fundamental problem we're in right now. But then Pajot's point to Vervaeke is you can't have the ecology of practices without the narrative. And I don't know. I think that I just feel like this goes back to this whole point on narrative, the whole debate on narrative and how fundamental it is, and and whether is there a kind of narrative that's not, I don't know, mythological in the way that Christianity is, or like Vervaeke argues we need a worldview that homes us but he's not putting forth sort of a narrative worldview in the sense that Christianity is a narrative worldview, but it's like sort of this like Neoplatonic scientific worldview. It still has sort of like an ontology and like this is, but it's not. I guess the issue is, can that be relatable to people who aren't, philosophically inclined? I don't know. The question I'm just thinking about it because this question of it came up in my family's group chat this week of like just looking at, I don't know, issues with our culture and just seeing like the collapse of religion and even just like communities, like cultural fragmentation happening. And it's like, okay, we need to address this somehow. And so like I brought up sort of this issue of like I feel torn between these two, the religion that is not a religion and the and some sort of renewed version of Christianity. And I don't know, I just feel like I don't know if I'm even making progress on that tension at all and resolving that tension, but because I feel like what the way that Christianity exists today does not provide, it does not offer an ecology of practices. There's no, particularly in the Protestant world, there's no sense of like, here's how you can become more like Christ. Like that's like that should be what we're oriented towards, right? And it's not. It's just sort of like it's a very emanation, like it's all God doing all the work. But it's like, yeah, but we meet God. It's like, yeah,
I think it's particularly a Protestant issue.
Yeah. But I also think about like in the Orthodox Church, for example, yes, they have their liturgy, but like I'm thinking about like, I don't know, Vervaeke's ecology of, I haven't yet really gotten a sense that like the Orthodox Church and the tradition and the liturgy and all of that is actually meeting what Vervaeke would like describe as the underlying principles for like an adequate ecology of practices. That's what I don't see. I haven't gotten that. And so that's like, I don't know. Like in my mind, it's like we should be doing martial arts at church or something like that. Like it's silly, but like that's like I question like is it adequate?
Well, I think ideally you can take the best of both, right? Because as both Pajot and Vanderclave said, like in a head-to-head competition, because there's like this gigantic structure already there, like in architecture alone, but obviously the communities of Christianity, like I know it's kind of an instrumentalist perspective, but if you're wanting to, address the meta crises, then reforming that seems, at least in some ways, much more plausible than starting from scratch in a sense. So I had already kind of taken that to heart as well. And then I was kind of looking for like the best version of a renewed Christianity. So process theology was kind of my go-to because the issue with the ecology of practices also is that, in Vervaeke's narrative, is I think the lack of teleology. And I think a lot of people feel lost without that. But with a more sophisticated like understanding of evolution, like you can kind of see that built in and more so rather than the pure random mutation and natural selection. Like um, there's another book I can show you or send you a link to from Logos to Bios, which is integrating Eriugenes Neoplatonic metaphysics and Aristotle into evolution. I don't know if I sent it to you before. This is going to go away in a minute. I'll bring it up. We can do maybe one more, and I'll show it to you. But the teleology aspect, and then also I think you can ideally integrate Vervaeke's ecology practices in a way where he recommends them, right? Like because within his model, like people are already doing them on their own. I mean, yeah, he's trying to form communities, sure, but ideally you should be able to integrate a lot of the best practices that he's recommending into, for example, Christianity. Like there's tons of Christian meditation stuff now. Like I'll still try to incorporate meditation. Like Charles Taylor, the Catholic philosopher, Canadian philosopher, uses this John Main Benedictine meditation that was derived from a Indonesian practice. So ideally, I think you can kind of integrate the set community that's already there with a reform or a renewed ecology practice. Because I agree, like just going to church, I don't think it's lacking. I haven't read it yet, but there was a group I was doing with Jared Morningstar, a reading group. He had a talk with John and Wojciech, him. It was on Nishitani, Religion and Nothingness.
Yeah, I think I remember watching that a while ago.
Yeah, so he had been doing a lot of reading groups on, he just did one on Process and Reality Whiteheads, which I didn't actually do because I felt like I wasn't in that headspace for it, but did one on Corban, Henry Corban, and then, Religion and Nothingness, which was my second reading through of it, and then, Whitehead's Religion in the Making, which got me into that, and then it was Knowledge in the Sacred by Nasser, who's like a Muslim traditionalist author. So I think this author, I found this author through him, so I shouldn't be surprised, but he's basically also largely of the traditionalist school, although he's Eastern Orthodox from South Africa. But basically that he's deriving it from, or he did his doctoral thesis on Erugena. So that was very encouraging, even though subsequently I've found some of his writings to be a little reactionary in a similar sense of like the Russian Moscow patriarch type today, but still looks really good for how it's integrating evolution and Neoplatonism and Aristotle. But yeah, I'd be curious for your thoughts on what I'd mentioned before, and like ideally you should be able to integrate in ecology practices, because I totally agree. People, like many modern people, just go to church on Sundays and then just have their propositions. I'm sure some of them actually do live, they might live quite holy lives, but at the same time, they're not necessarily helping address some of the underlying epistemological or ontological issues of the meaning crisis, that like they're just kind of in their bubble doing well. Whereas, I think bringing in Vervaeke's ideas and like DC Schindler's and using the ecology practices and various new practices models, ideally, would be a good cross fertilization with the church.
Well, it seems like, yes, you can find these sort of meditative and contemplative practices in the Christian tradition, but they're like in this weird deep corner of the Christian tradition, or even if it's not a weird corner, it doesn't seem like readily accessible to just your average churchgoer. Like it's sort of like, oh, you have to read some of the, church fathers or, theologians and etc. And whereas like the liturgy, everyone participates in that. And like, it's just part of their, like, it just seems like, I don't know, maybe there's more in, Orthodoxy, for example, that I'm just not aware of because I'm not close enough to it. But do you get what I'm saying? Like it's these practices don't feel like they're just there as part of the life of your average Orthodox Christian. It seems like, oh yeah, you have to dig. Like if you're really interested in Orthodoxy, then you dig and then you find these things. And um so that's kind of how I see it. It's like that's where the issue is. But your point that like you could integrate these things, um I mean, yeah, the Orthodox tradition in particular has a lot of um it's it feels like it's a little bit, there's a lot of inertia to it. And so I don't know how successful you're gonna be in that particular tradition, but like um in the Protestant world, you just go make your own church and then you can do whatever you want, more or less. But
Yeah, I guess in the best case scenario, that is one reason why I'm sort of drawn to Catholicism as a kind of middle ground between those, because you have like Vatican II, like they're open to, you could say, like living tradition or organic development, ideally, even though the aftermath of that, the implementation, as I've been reading, was not ideal. The attempt in the council itself seemed salutary and very, yeah, a lot of good stuff in there. And there was a mention in the RCIA class I'm going through that I had mentioned before, of Lectio Divina. So that kind of alerted me. I was like, oh, that's good to know they actually know about that and they're recommending people do it. Because I think, like I had said, most of the practices that Vervicki is already recommending, like you do them on your own anyway. You know, they're individualistic practices, which is fine for what they are. So if you like, I don't think it's an issue to integrate those, especially if you give them, like I mentioned, the John Main was a Benedictine monk who integrated very similar to Vipassana meditation, but I think it was using Maranatha, which is like the Aramaic word um, for like calling forth like God's presence as a kind of prayer, doing that as the mantra basically for the meditation,
mm,
integrating that from someone in Indonesia. So I assume that they were connected to kind of Indian Hindu tradition, but like learning, the techniques from them. And then he later found that a very similar technique was used by like one of the desert monks in early Christianity, John Cassian. So you can find, like you said, you have to dig, but you can find those sorts of things. But I guess what I'm saying is the individual, like you can already do those individual practices, or you're already doing them individualistically, whether you are within the narrative framework or not. So if you have both, it seems, kind of ideal. And then like within orthodoxy, they have like Pajot will often say, the breath work combined with the Jesus prayer, which was interesting convergence with prajna that Vervaeke was talking about, like the inhalation,
yeah.
the expansion, like the ideal, and then exhalation is like understanding your finitude. So I've been doing that a bit as well, actually. And I also think once again, ideally the various Christian traditions can now hopefully, take the best of each to sort of integrate it. Like, for example, that breath work and Jesus prayer from the East um, into the West, for example. But I remember I don't know if you saw this one, but Pajot talked with Alexander Bard. Are you familiar with him much?
I'm familiar with him, yeah, a little bit.
And
I
then
don't
he
know that I
was,
saw that conversation though.
yeah, it would be great to watch. I'd recommend it. I think it was just once. It was four of them. Yeah, also with Andrew Sweeney, and
Oh,
then the Gerardian guy, Thomas Hammerlich. They were talking about religions and, yeah, the return of religion. And Alexander Bard, who I used to be much more into his work, and I still find him fascinating. But he was talking about how Christianity's issue was it tried to bring the tantric, which is the sort of supposed to be like exceptional level, again, like sort of secret mystical rites into the public sphere with the cannibalistic symbolism of the mass, and that it therefore left out the individual actual secretive tantric practices because everything was brought into the public sphere. And
Hmm.
Pajo was basically, well, he was pushing back a little bit because they have like the hidden door or something in Orthodoxy, but largely still a public ceremony. So in that sense, they're like trying to synthesize everything into the liturgy or the mass, as opposed to having individual practice. But at the same time, I mean, they'll emphasize prayer and everything, and that can be definitely a form of contemplation or meditation, depending on
Yeah,
how it's done. So I think there's resources.
yeah. I know it's an ongoing question for me, but I find myself getting into this mode of like trying to figure it all out. Like, what's the final, what's the final solution to
Well, you know how
this
Vervaeke feels about
tension?
that term.
Yes. Uh, yeah, yeah. Neither nostalgia nor utopia. That's the that's the thing I keep coming back to.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, and it's it definitely feels more of a challenge to fight against the nostalgia from within the tradition. So that's why I'm like really inspired by figures like DC Schindler, who because his book The Perfection of Freedom like explicitly acknowledged that there was elements in the Romantics, specifically Schiller, Hegel, and Schelling, that the classical tradition had not addressed. That there was genuine new insights. So when I kind of understood that, and he's like quite Orthodox Catholic, it was very very inspiring. And then also recently, I've been listening to his talk with Larry Chapp. He was saying in Aquinas, there may have been too much emphasis. Speaking of which, on or a lack of emphasis on beauty, because apparently there's debate on whether Aquinas even considered beauty a transcendental, which is surprising. And that, well, in Love and the Postmodern Condition, have you finished that by the way?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, me
I
neither. I'm
will.
going through it slowly.
I will get to it.
Um, yeah, I know it's so short, but I'm also taking forever on it. Uh, that one of his main arguments is that the issue, which is partially there in Aquinas, but then there's also elements where he pushes back against it. The issue of connecting the will to goodness as opposed to beauty leads to all these negative effects that sort of Locke exemplifies, and that so basically he's willing to to criticize figures within the tradition that are often taken as somewhat infallible, seeming at least on a stereotypical reading or hearing from some sort of traditionalist perspectives, and saying like the medievals didn't get everything right, and like John Milbank saying that modernity was contingent, and that there's like a version of modernity that was missed, that can be like the goods of modernity being material welfare and free of sin, in the sense of like democratic, what would you say, yeah, assent, like ASSENT, as opposed to previous more top-down hierarchical systems
Yeah.
that can be integrated into a proper, I guess you could say, return of. Well, John Milbank is very very high on the term Christendom, um, but I really like his work, so that sort of thing, yeah, that was encouraging to avoid the nostalgia aspect. Figures like John
Yeah.
Milbank and David Bentley Hart as well, for sure, even though he's almost very idiosyncratic in how revolutionary he is.
I do have a sense of like figures like Pajot, there's a certain like I want to say almost arrogance in like yeah, but Christianity is the whole story, and it's already figured all of this out, and all of the problems we're experiencing today are like the Christian story speaks to all of it. And so why do we need anything new? Sort of like the I that's a that's unfair to Pajot, but like there's an element of that I sense in, I don't know, when I'm in the Orthodox sort of world and I like, go to the Orthodox parish or whatever, there's a little bit of that sort of like, yeah, we have it figured out, we have the right way. It feels like the nostalgic thing, like if we can only just get back to
Yeah.
And that does trouble me, in the same way that sort of like, these various utopic visions trouble me. And so I just feel like on some level I don't know, like I was saying in our text exchange, there's a trying to get to a place of like trust when it comes to a community, to belong to a community I can identify with and belong to. I always have this underlying suspicion in both directions of like, are you, uh, uh, are you sort of like going too far into this utopic vision, like sort of more progressive leaning church or community would, or like how I often feel with the Orthodox Church is the opposite. And it's just difficult to recognize, I guess on some level there's always going to be missing the mark on some level, and it's like, because that's just the nature of humans and community and all of that.
And the fun of processing.
Right. Yeah. And so that's kind of where I am, is like, how do I trust despite, and also like reduce the combinatorial explosion of like, as if I'm standing out on the outside, like, what community should I step into and belong to? It's like, I can't possibly answer that question, because there's just so many variables, and so like it's, I don't know, it just seems like a very, for a lot of people, not just for me, but in like this culturally fragmented place, it feels very much like vocationally too, for me, that I've experienced that, which is like confronting the combinatorial explosion of the problem of what should I do, who am I, what is my purpose, what am I here to do. It's like, without the constraints of like other people and like where I am now and all of that, it's like, it's impossible to answer that question.
Yeah.
So on some level, and I think this came up in our conversation over text, of like there's an element of faith of like just accepting where you are, and then like what's present right here, like rather than like trying to survey the whole globe for the exact right way, the right community for you, that I don't know, it's like that you have to have an element of faith.
But I think also, like you're saying, almost taking advantage of the constraints by saying like, what's the most good you can do within your current context, because you have limited resources, and you already have the opportunity based on your constraints to best fit into a particular community. So I mean, in your case, like, it sounds like you're going to be moving to Reading, so that
Yeah.
You don't necessarily have to try to find the perfect one here now that you're probably moving, for example. Um, and I quite relate and definitely think the sort of local is important as opposed to kind of the abstract universal ideal community, which
But that requires trusting those constraints, like trusting, like, okay, I'm not gonna spend all my time questioning the place that I've been, that I find myself in. It's just accept that, and then how can I, do the most good? Like, it's okay to question, like, am I in the right place? But like, that can't be the question that you have to accept on some level, like, I'm here, how can I, given
right,
that, how can I, you know, do the most
right.
good?
I guess for me, as far as the trust question, I wonder if this is inappropriate or if it's a function of our internet era, but finding certain figures, like first, John, and then now someone like John Milbank and DC Schindler, actually, in some ways, where I do feel that sense of trust in their credibility and their um yeah, in a kind of holistic sense, then I feel like committing at the institutional level, for example, for me, uh, for Catholicism, which, like I said in the text, is also kind of a contingent constraint because of Olivia. It seems as though I'd be able to do more good, even though in some ways, I mean, this has been kind of my uh, stress, as I mentioned, of like not wanting to be self-deceptive and like putting down, say, the Eastern Orthodox Church, because in some ways I do think it is better, although in other ways less so, like the concerns you mentioned.
Yeah.
But then I'm like, how important is the kind of contingent constraints of like, your own community that you can more effectively integrate with given where you're at in a sense. But also because Catholicism is so relatively large, then you're more able to find figures that sort of inspire your particular temperament and abilities, like DC Schindler for me. And then even though John Milbank's Anglican, he's very, very Catholic friendly. And then if you find those kind of figures at the particular level, you can fractally have trust with them at the most particular level, and then the institution in a kind of general sense that you participate in and try to do the best you can without trying to reform it in a fundamental way, because that then it's like you probably shouldn't join it, but still wanting to reform it and being the best version of itself way. And then at the most basic level of like the good and like the figure of Christ as what you trust in. And then that scales out to more particular figures like theologians that you're sort of following and trust in my case. So that's, I guess, kind of how I'm seeing it currently. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's what came to mind when you were talking about having these figures that you trust is like, I've found I've been able to engage in conversations with not just Orthodox people, but Protestants as well. Um, like, given the influence that, and I don't even know if this is what you were saying exactly, but this is what came to mind, was given the influence that these, public figures have had on me, and the trust that I have in them, and sort of the enriched participatory worldview that I've had through them. It's like I'm able to converse in a way that um I guess meets the people where they are, in like the particular um while still sort of like discovering at the same time, like how to integrate that into this this sort of worldview that homes me. Um, and like I guess that the idea being like I'm able to have more productive conversations because I have the vocabulary, I guess.
Hmm.
And but I don't know that that's what you were saying exactly. I wonder if you could expand on that, like the fractal, the trust that you have for these public figures going down fractally into the particular. What exactly? What does that look like for you?
Okay, yeah, I guess I meant that you can sort of commit at the institutional level if, because in my case, because there's also particular figures within it that are also committed at the institutional level that you have great trust for it and that you can kind of
I
follow
see.
their particular line of theology, because
I see.
like as
Okay.
Chesterton said, the like the church or the Catholic Church is kind of like a large playground with high walls, but within that space there's like a lot of room for diverse opinions within like different theological schools, for example. And yeah, I feel like I've kind of found the figures that resonate, which kind of revolve a lot around John Scotus Erugena. All three of those theologians I was mentioning, well, Vervaeke and then Milbank and DC Shin, they're all seem to have sort of a similar metaphysics and theology that I find very well, both beautiful and plausible, which is great.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think okay. Yeah, I understand better what you're saying. I think I've been able to do that with um Pajot to some degree, and then kind of how Vervaeke feeds into Pajot.
Hmm.
Um, and so yeah, I think I get that.
Well, regarding Pajot, I did want to address what you mentioned about the issue you had with him sort of making it seem as though Christianity has nothing to learn from other traditions. And I know you acknowledge it's a little exaggerated, but I used to feel that like very strongly. I used to write so many notes, sort of arguing with Pajot in my head and in my notes, and still, yeah, I still very much sympathize with that, and I still remember one of my main arguments. There's probably others I still agree with, but I feel like he's gotten much more. I don't know if it's me or him, but I don't mind him nearly as much as I used to. I used to kind of listen to him in an almost um, preparatory, argumentative way, but now I'm like totally cool with. I basically already know the sorts of things he's going to say, and I feel like he's gotten a lot more charitable or like, I don't know, peaceful in his communication style. I don't know if it's me or him though. Um, I think it's him, which is great. But anyway, I still remember like I'd write these gigantic comments on his YouTube videos where one of them was the issue that like he acknowledged that Christianity integrated the best of paganism, right? But then to me it seemed as though given it didn't really have much contact with Eastern traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism, it seemed to me as though that would need to occur again. There would need to be some kind of cross pollination. And David Bentley Hart very much does make this argument, especially with Vedanta, which he's quite sympathetic to, that ideally the way Aquinas made use of Aristotle, we'd have theologians today making use of the best of Vedanta or Buddhist metaphysics or ideas. And in some ways, yeah, I would like to see that happen to a degree that basically Hart will say that even though Aquinas said, all other cultures, have their own kind of imperfect or incomplete insights into the truth. They just don't have the fullness of the truth, and that's basically what Vatican II also said. But then Hart will go further and say that they also have insights that Christianity and the West don't have or never had that they can learn from. And to me, that seems very plausible. Like even just something simple like mindfulness meditation, um, it seems hard to deny. So I do think that that can be raised, but like Pajot will say, it has to kind of be integrated in an organic way that takes time, within that tradition for it to understand itself rather than force it. Um, But then, like I said, there's ways that they're already kind of being integrated, like the John Main Benedictine meditation that I mentioned that Charles
Mhm.
Taylor did. So yeah, in that sense, I agree with that critique to a degree.
Hmm. Well, I
Although
think yeah, go ahead.
Milbank will say that the integration of Platonism and Neoplatonism was kind of a providential event at that time because it was just intrinsic to the grammar of first century Palestine and the early church, and that Milbank is pretty critical of Hinduism, although he thinks Buddhism has a kind of transcendent idea of the good and with the bodhisattva ideal, which doesn't fit within their own cultural framework that he thinks can be drawn out. Um, which is to say that he has somewhat less charitable perspective than David Bentley Hart, but still sort of that perspective. But he's much more like pro-Western legacy, but also very
Mhm.
much pro-Western philosophy.
Hmm.
Go ahead, sorry.
I was actually gonna say I think I'm hitting the end of my rope here, like attention wise. And we've only got 9 minutes left on our call.
Yeah,
But I
so I
would
feel
love
like
to
I've
do
been
this, love to do this again soon.
I feel like I've been talking a lot on this one. I feel like I haven't given you much chance to
That's okay.
share your thoughts.
Yeah, don't worry about it. I have to take the perspective on these sorts of conversations is like each one is I'm practicing like the art of conversing. And I always have this critical voice in my head of like, oh, I should have been this way or that way. And uh I'm just learning more and more of like, it's practice and every time I do it, I learn from it. And so there's no judgment at all.
I feel like I've gotten out of the good practice of listening and dialectic since I haven't been doing as much meditation. Like I've gotten more into the propositional with reading theology and wish I could find a balance again.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm kind of in a similar boat in the sense that like mine I tend to withdraw and like isolate myself. Just that's always been my, sort of defense mechanism, I guess, in life.
Yeah,
And
me too.
and when I do that, then uh I fall out of, I don't know, just getting feedback from the world and other people and get into this, I don't know, propositional mode where it's like I want to understand everything before I go back out into the world. And it's silly, but yeah, so I relate to that a lot. And it's these sorts of things that I find very helpful for getting me out of that. It's like just get back into relating to other people and hopefully getting like some pushback on my like, you know, probably being way too up in my head about things, from, in a idiosyncratic way, get some like, I don't know, come back down to earth and interact with other people. And anyway, so I would love to do this again soon. I think I mentioned like it would be great to do like a semi-regular thing, um, if that's something you're up for. Not that we have to, have a, you know, put it on the calendar every week or
Right.
whatever, but um, it would be good just for the reasons I mentioned, for me at least.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think my tendencies and potential temperamental downsides are the same as yours. So hopefully we can counterbalance instead of exacerbate the head
Yeah.
head sort of thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
and what you mentioned about going out or we're trying to figure things out before you got into society reminded me of that quote I really liked from the talk between the three of them. DC Schindler said, where Hegel on Kant said he tries to learn how to swim before getting into the water, which I
Yeah,
thought
yeah,
was a really good critique of that sort of thing. Yeah.
yeah. That's a really good example. Yeah.
Well, how are what's your sister's stance and your brother-in-law in terms of religion, I guess, in Reading?
Are you familiar with Bethel Church at all in Reading?
Well, I used to go to a church called Bethel Church. Is that like is it connected, I
No,
wonder?
no, I don't think so. It's unlikely that it's connected. They're just a particularly charismatic brand of um, I don't know, evangelicalism. I
Like
don't feel like that's exactly
Pentecostal?
the right word. Yeah. And they have
Okay.
somewhat of like a almost like a cult following in Reading. Like
Oh,
the uh a lot of Reading's economy is kind of like that they're fueling a lot of Reading's economy because there's not a lot going on in Reading, and like
hmm,
even the company I'm working for, that they're recruits for engineers, they draw a lot from that church.
hmm,
And it's huge. It's like there's lines to get into church on Sunday. They have multiple services, and it's very much about the um, the Holy Spirit, and uh, they have these very extravagant, sensational worship services, and uh, they have their healing rooms. They're like really big into the miraculous healing, and
oh wow.
I question some of the validity of the claims they make with regard to that. Um,
Placebo
but the
effect
whole
can explain some.
was that
Placebo effect might explain some, but the guy you were mentioning while we were hiking, remember the Michael Levin
yeah,
and yeah.
yeah, okay, yeah, yeah, that's a whole conversation, like the topic of miracles and placebo and all of that is something I'm very interested in, and it's I remain very skeptical a lot of the particular claims, but that's an ongoing conversation that I have with my sisters around that, and sort of it ties into like various metaphysics, and uh because all of that is those are all connected, and so that's been really interesting, is like just having conversations with family members around that. And um anyway, I'm looking forward to this being kind of an opportunity to like dialogue more with that community, because
Yeah,
it's sort of been there, and I have differences with it, and um but it's an opportunity to sort of open up more dialogue.
yeah, that'd
um
be interesting. Do
yeah,
you have like a fairly good relationship with your sisters, or do you see them?
I do, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
cool. What's the population size of Reading compared to where you live now?
um I'm not sure exactly. It's slightly more rural, but like rural in general, just the surrounding area. Probably probably fairly similar population though.
Hmm.
Uh, just like I don't know, probably slightly less. I don't know the exact numbers. Um, and it depends on if you're including like the whole Santa Cruz County or just the city.
Hmm.
Um, but it's definitely there's a lot less like wealth and economic activity there. It's
Okay,
more depressed of an area.
might be a connection. Huh. I wonder if there's a connection there between the church culture and the lack of economic productivity. I don't know. Huh.
I don't know. That's interesting. I mean, Bethel has a huge influence even outside that area.
Hmm.
Um, like their music is used, like they have their own sort of uh, music production
think I might have
Uh,
heard of that. Yeah.
just it's called Bethel Music, and uh, yeah, like churches all over, Protestant churches all over use their music. It's some of it's good music. I actually enjoy it, but
Hmm.
particularly like their instrumental music.
Been listening to more choral music for Christmas.
Oh, cool.
But I think this is going to end. So
Yeah,
in case it does, have a great Christmas, and we'll keep in touch
yeah,
in
you as well.
January again.
Yeah, let's do it. I look forward to it.